for joining me today. Remember to wear your mask up at all times. And we're talking today about language and culture and the relationship between the two. The idea was that studying the language of a community gave access to that community's culture. Now here's a definition from Oxford English Dictionary. A dictionary that you can access online via the university platform when you go to the library page. Okay, that's one of the digital resources that we have a subscription for through the university. So you can go and check the definition. And here's what it says. Culture is the distinctive ideas, customs, social behavior, products or way of life of a particular nation, society, people, or period. Okay. And so you would say that a culture is a society characterized by these elements. You need to bear in mind that it also applies to different periods. So you have, in archaeology, they describe culture of the Neanderthal, culture of the Latin. That's because of the sites that were excavated and the findings. So it can be through space or time, indifferently. So the main idea is that language reveals the way of viewing the world. So that there's this notion that there is a close relationship between language, culture, and thought. There are three features that you need to remember about culture. It's a form of knowledge acquired in a social group. It does not depend on an individual. It belongs to a social group and it is passed on to members of the group. So it's an unconscious process. You don't decide to acquire a culture. You're just born in it or you join it at a later stage. And one of the manifestations of culture is the categorization of things and people around us. And this is where we go back to our starting point. The categories are expressed in language. Let's look at this notion of categories with the example of dog. You can use the term dog for any animal which belongs to the category. Okay, so the word refers to an abstract notion and you classify animals that you come across in this category or not. You say, well, that's not a dog, that's a dog. I need to interrupt myself to remind everyone to wear the mask at all times. But that's nice, I can play air hostess from there. The life jacket is under your seat, and the mask must be worn at all times. Have a pleasant flight. I can't do the gestures because I'm holding the mic. So, wear the bloody mask and keep quiet. This is the not very nice air hostess voice. Yes, so categories are like notions, they're abstract. And they help you decide what's what, really. You see an animal, you have this notion of dog, and you say, oh, that's a dog. But you need to bear in mind that different cultures associate different features to the categories. For instance, if you think of a dog, for us in France it's generally associated with a pet, a domesticated animal, which is generally friendly and cuddly. In other cultures, the dog is essentially a working animal. Vet or biologist, you think of dog as a mammal of the canid branch, which is essentially domestic and has several breeds. Okay, so the notion varies, and there are cultural features in the notion. So these categories reflect our cultures, essentially our beliefs and customs, our ways of life, our traditions. Je fais comme si je ne voyais pas les gens qui ont baissé le masque, les gens qui font autre chose, les gens qui bavardent, et je fais le cours pour ceux qui ont l'air d'essayer de suivre, et je vous confirme que tout sera sur Béatrice un peu plus tard dans la semaine. Donc l'idée c'est de prendre note des commentaires et des explications. Et vous avez à chaque fois un numéro de diapo. Donc vous pouvez noter sur la diapo 3, elle a dit ça et ça, et vous compléterez avec ce qu'il y a sur la diapo. Ok, here's some methodology for you. And now, let's look at colors. That language also categorizes, and in very different ways across languages. If you think of words are labels for categories to some extent, it's quite obvious to see with colors. Of course, human beings are equipped to perceive colors in a certain way. We can't perceive the infrareds, but we can perceive quite a range of colors. And scientists have described how dogs can see color, or how horses can see color, or bees, and it's quite different. But for human beings, it's generally the same. So all people can perceive the colors, but not all languages name them, not in the same way. There's one of the languages of New Guinea that has two words, two color words, and it's black or white. And that's all they have in the language. In one of the Inuit languages of Greenland, they have those two, and they have three more. And in English, you have the first 5 that I mentioned, plus 6 more. Okay? But then people are capable of seeing a lot more nuances. But there's no particular name, so people will describe or compare. One that I like is the famous color called camel. And it's hard to say what it is. Can I think of the English for it? It's the famous color that is in French, it's sometimes camel or taupe or mastic, and it's like brownish yellow, perhaps brownish grey. So you have to describe and use objects of this color to try and describe the color. So these are the color words, and then, of course, you can always try to describe more colors. So this goes to show that some conceptual differences are lexicalized in some languages, but not others. For instance, red and green are not relevant for everyone, so they have languages that do not identify them. But if they see something red, they can say it's the color of ripe cherries. And so they describe it as the color of ripe cherries, because they can see it and they can tell it apart from others. Another linguistic systems which reveals a number of categories and also the differences in categories is kinship terms. So in this case we have a system in the language that describes relations. And the interesting thing is that this is a terminology. That is to say, the words have one meaning only, and they refer to one thing. And if you have that one thing, there's only one word for it. That's a term. And that's how precise the system is here. So we're quite familiar with the kinship terms such as brother, mother, grandmother, aunt, and cousin, and so on. But in fact, there are different categories across languages. For instance, the English word uncle applies to your male parent's brother, as well as your female parent's brother. And the definition uses male parent or female parent because brother and mother, father and mother, are categories, and they may mean different things in different cultures. In one of the other languages of Papua New Guinea, if I'm right, not if, I have seen in the slides that Mr. Jackson told you about the great variety of languages that you can find in some territories. And it's very much the case in Papua New Guinea. It's a small place, but with a very rich variety of languages. And in the Watam language, there are two words to distinguish the male parent's brother and the female parent's brother. I put mother for the sake of brevity. Okay? Because these are categories that are relevant in their culture, so they have different words. If you look at Norwegian, they distinguish two categories of grandmother, where the English only has grandmother. In Norwegian, they distinguish your father's mother or your mother's mother. Okay? Another feature for categories can be age. Here we've been looking at gender essentially, and a distinction based on whether the relative is on the maternal branch or paternal branch. But age is also another criterion. So a lot of studies have been carried out which established 6 basic patterns of kinship, which you have here, and you can read the article on Wikipedia you should, I strongly recommend that you visit the link. And you can see the 6 patterns that have been identified with the subject here as a grey triangle called ego, because that's the convention. Ego is Latin for me. So if I start with me, I can consider my parents, my siblings, okay? So in the Hawaiian kinship pattern, you start with the subject, and you have a person called mother, okay, that's the female parent, and the mother's mother is also called mother, and the mother's brother is also called father. That's why I was saying earlier, mother and father can apply to different people. The term for mother and father. And it's the same on the paternal side. You have a father who's ego's parent, and his brother is called father for ego. Right? It's in relationship to the grey triangle, which is the center. And the father's sister is also called mother. Whereas in the Iroquois kinship pattern, the father's sister is called aunt. But the father's brother is also called father. So here are the 6 patterns: Sudanese pattern, Eskimo kinship pattern, Iroquois, Crow, and Oman. And the question is, which one corresponds to the English kinship pattern? How do we describe a family in English? Any idea? Yes, you're right. Well done. In English, the pattern is the same. So English kinship terms correspond to the Eskimo type. I will say a word about Eskimo later. It's a sort of traditional term, but the people of Greenland and the northern polar circle don't want to be called this. Okay? It's taken as a racist term today, and the designation, the preferred designation is Inuit. But when these studies were made, they used this term. It's the same for Iroquois. That's a French name for a group of people in North America, and I don't think they call themselves that. That's something you can look into. It's called demonyms, the names of peoples. And sometimes they are given from outsiders, and there's a word for it that's just slipping my mind. So sometimes there's a difference between the name that the people give themselves and the names given by outsiders. And with the people of Europe having colonized a lot of places, they have given names to places and people which do not always correspond to the way the people call themselves. In several parts of the world, people call themselves people or humans. But the colonizers sometimes choose different things. Anyway, that's another question. I wanted to show you this list of family and related words in English is taken from the Cambridge Dictionary of English, which you can visit with the link provided on slide 7. And I find it interesting because there are terms with no equivalent in French. I'm not sure what maiden aunt is. Now, when you visit the page, the words are all clickable. It's a list with links so you can check the definitions if you're not sure what kin means. And the expression, where is it? Kirstenkin. You can click and check the meaning. You can see that when you go further in the previous generations, you have great something, great aunt, great grandchild, great granddaughter. Whereas the French uses arrière. Just to remind you that when you translate, you can't just use the French equivalent. No? There's no way you can say arrière in English to this. And there's another one that you can't really translate literally, is beau. If you think about it, it's strange to call people in your family beau, beau-père, beau-frère, belle-sœur. And this applies to two distinct categories, whereas in English, the categories are lexicalized. That's what I was telling you earlier. And there is a distinct term for beau-frère as your spouse's brother, or beau-frère as the son of your parents' second spouse. Are you with me? So what are they in English? If I think of my husband's brother, what do I call that? Yes? That's right. In-law, brother-in-law. So my husband's mother is my mother-in-law. Okay. And if you think of all of your spouse's family, you can call them your in-laws. And what do you call the son of your parents' second spouse? Another kind of beau-frère. That's right. Stepbrother. So where the French language only has one term and does not really distinguish the categories, in English you have two terms to reflect two categories. Okay? I hope you made a note of this because it's not on the slide. Another area of language that has been studied in relation to culture is time concepts. And with time being something particularly abstract, or essentially abstract, it's interesting to note that it's measured in English like a concrete object or series of objects. You can talk about 3 days in the same way as you talk about 3 books or 3 students. 3 students who are not wearing their masks properly. I think I need to tell you the story I told the other groups. But you're the 4th group, so I find myself repeating myself a bit, but still. My dad's in hospital for heart surgery. And one of the reasons why I can't visit him, apart from the state of our relationship, is that the COVID virus is still circulating, and no one wants George to have COVID on top of a heart condition. And my job puts me at risk because I am locked in a room with dozens of people, some of whom don't wear the mask properly. But I've tried stronger masks, and I find that I can't teach with them, so I have to make do with this. And I have to ring up my dad because I can't visit him in hospital because of the virus. Anyway, so if you're not doing this for me, do it for George. And wear your mask up on your nose. So, the terms used, and I'm giving you English examples, but you can compare this with French and other languages that you know. The terms used to describe time reflect the conceptual system that the speaker has of time. Okay? There's been a famous, I should say infamous, controversy about the Hopi people in North America whose conceptual system of time was questioned because the language did not use the same categories as the English language. Okay. Most people conceive time by comparison with space. So we have different categories which reflect this comparison or analogy. That's why we conceive of time as passing, and we think of evolution through time as movement. In French and English and a lot of languages, we have the future ahead of us and the past behind us. And we are used to chronologies with the ancient period on the left and the progress of time going from left to right, because that's how we also write. But these categories are not the same for every language. And if you think of the verbal system, it's quite straightforward to think that verb forms refer to time, with a past form referring to the past, and so on for present and future. But have you ever realized that in English there is no future? There is no future sense, no future tense as such. But of course, people who speak English can conceive the future. They have the concept. But the language refers to this with an expression and not with one particular verb tense. If I say, I don't think it will rain this week. In fact, will is the present form of a modal auxiliary. And what I'm saying is I don't think I can make a prediction about rain happening in the future. So it's a present tense. And it's the same for going to. I don't think it's going to rain. Is going to rain is clearly a present, but it's an expression which indicates that I am drawing conclusions from my observations. So this is another illustration of the fact that not all languages have the same categories. So in the 19th century, when these studies really started with sort of scientific objective, there emerged this theory of linguistic relativity in two sorts of forms with two different degrees. The main idea was that the structure of language influences thought, and that our perception of the world was influenced by the predetermined categories in our language. And the stronger version of this theory was that language actually determines thought, and that there's an equivalence between what we say and what we think, and what we are able to think. This theory was taken up by a writer who wrote a fiction, a dystopian fiction of describing a future where language was controlled by the authorities. Does that ring a bell? A book where there is a special form of language controlled by the authorities. Yes? That's right, that's what I was thinking of. Thank you. In 1984, people live in a tyranny, and the dictators try to control people's minds by controlling language. And they even created the newspeak, la novlangue, although I think it's called something different in the latest translation. A newspeak the reference to George Orwell is not on the slide, so instead of doing your hair, you could make a note of this. Do you know what they say in Scotland? They say, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. What was I saying? Yes. So the idea in this book is that if you have no word for freedom, you can't have the concept. You can't think of freedom, and you can't aspire to freedom when you're deprived of it. If you have no word for autonomy, for critical thinking, for democracy, then you won't have that idea. So this is a sort of extrapolation of the strong hypothesis of linguistic relativity. But this theory emerged in the 19th century along with the theories that defended racism, basically. So the ethnographers, linguists, explorers who went and studied new cultures and languages arrived there with their own prejudices and biases. And the general bias was that some cultures were superior to others. Some languages were superior to others. Can you when the people of the native peoples of America were studied, well, sometimes it was not, idea was how can we explain the Christian religion to them? So people were interested because they wanted to do something with them. In other studies, it was just a scientific purpose, but it was influenced by all those prejudices. With the evolution of science, experiments were designed to make sure you could test your hypothesis in a clear way. And scientists developed a certain awareness of their own biases, and they realized that they influenced their conclusions, and sometimes even the observations. And so they started to fight them and try to keep them under control. And with the new methodology, which involved the refusal of bias, they reached new results. And I think this is a nice illustration of how science advances. People have an intuition. They elaborate it into scientific hypotheses, and then they go out and they carry out experiments to try and prove the hypothesis. And with the progress of technology, of methodology, of even reflection, new generations of scientists arrive and say, oh, this was not done exactly in the right way, and if we do it correctly, what are we going to find? And sometimes they find that the original hypothesis was wrong, or perhaps too radical. That's why I would like to encourage you to check what hypothesis people start from. When you hear today people who defend a language because it is the best in the world, or because it comes from a long tradition, you may wonder why they discuss language without being a linguist. And you may wonder what theory allows them to say that one language is the best in the world. Because serious linguists today explain that there is no difference in the quality of languages. A language is a language. No language is better than any other. And there's no reason to think that people with a better language are better people. If you see what I mean. So the language relativity hypothesis is also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, from the names of two scholars, two scientists, who, now let me make this clear, the hypothesis is named after their two names, but it's just two people who carried out their own research and reached similar conclusions, but separately, okay? They didn't work together. There's a famous pair of English linguists who we've all read as Mr. Lapère and Mr. Roger. And they're very eminent French linguists who specialize in English. So you can read books by Lapère and Roger. But not by these two, okay? These two are just people who worked at the same period. You can see late 19th century, early 20th century. So their research dates from the early 20th century. They were both specialists of Native American languages, and they reached the same sort of conclusions, but separately. Okay? And one can be summarized by this quote from Benjamin Lee Webb: "We dissect nature along the lines laid down by our native language." This is another way of phrasing the strong hypothesis that language determines thought. So this was the time of the Hopi time controversy, and they also studied the categories of animate, inanimate, saying, oh, this word has the same linguistic characteristics as another word for an animate word. So they probably think that the two words have the same characteristics. So a person and an object, for instance. But the evolution of science in anthropology and linguistics showed that the hypothesis was too radical. And one of the things they didn't do was consider the question from another point of view. So they said, oh, in the Hopi language they don't have words for time, so they probably can't think of time. And it's all this myth about people who are free of time because they are in contact with nature. You know, how can I say this? A lot of bull, if you ask me. Don't put this in your notes. You could put it in your notes in big letters. No, in fact, even if you live on ice and hunt, and you still have a notion of time. In the case of the Hopi, they didn't live in ice, they lived in Arizona. But if you consider the question from the other people's point of view, you could have this sort of conversation. Did you know that the suburban white males have over 100 words for lawn? Because it seems to be such a big preoccupation. Lawn, you know lawn, the grass you grow outside your house when you have a house. So this is sort of the boomerang coming back after people said, how amazing! The Eskimos have over 100 words for snow. First, you don't call them Eskimos. This is a demonym that was applied by foreigners to these people. There's a rap song that says, don't call me Eskimo. It's an insult. And of course, some people live in an environment covered in snow, so they will describe snow. You need to press the green button and push the button. Okay. So, in the 20th century, late 20th century, the theory of linguistic determinism was severely questioned, and people started doing field trips with more robust methodology, and they also started to reverse the question. And here's an example. Think of a tribe whose language has grammatical feminine markers for females and the same markers for objects such as stone and chair. Would you conclude that for this tribe, stone and chair have female attributes just because they work in the language in a way similar to girl and woman? That would be jumping to conclusions, wouldn't it? And yes, French, and the examples of La Pierre, which has a linguistic form and function similar to La Femme. But does it mean that they are in the same category, conceptual category? Nah. So this is how confusion can lead to certain conclusions which are just abusive. Okay? So in the case of woman, you have an overlap of biological and linguistic features, but the categories do not always correspond. So you could have feminine words in French that have absolutely no biological female features, okay? Just like lashes. And this is the sort of thing you need to pay attention to when people discuss languages and cultures, and they pass judgment on languages, and they extend this judgment to the people who speak that language, just because they mix, and I'm not sure it's genuine confusion, sometimes it's intentional. They take shortcuts, and they put things together and say, look, we can do this and other people can't. And as I say, it's a lot of bull. So this story about snow, there was a time when it was like a commonplace to say that Eskimos had over 100 words for snow. Now, as I said, don't call them Eskimo. The people of Northern America. Now, if you look at the polar circle above Siberia, that's other types of peoples and other language families. But if you look at Greenland and Northern Canada, up there, not up here, the people are called Inuit, and their language is Inuktitut with different dialects. Now, they have a distinction, which is unusual for us, and that's between falling snow and snow on the ground. And based on that, they can describe a variety of situations involving snow. So they will, in the language, you will find expressions, different phrases based on the two words canuck and apud. Okay? But if you think of the English language, there are a lot of words to describe snow. But no one would think, oh, it's natural because their environment includes a lot of snow. So this goes back to my first idea that, it's not my idea, the fact that some categories are lexicalized and others aren't, je suis bien honest. And if the category is not lexicalized, you can always develop an expression to account for your experience. Okay? So scientists today agree that the speakers are not limited in their perception and their expression by their languages. You can always perceive things. And you can use different expressions to describe them. For instance, if you put me in front of the green lights on the horizon at the North Pole, I can always say, oh, I would love to see the green lights on the horizon, but it's called aurora or northern lights. And even if you've never seen it, you can always explain and perhaps find the word if there is one. So here are some intermediary conclusions. The theory of linguistic relativity is very very hard to study on the field. Empirically means, in fact, to find situations, objects, traces that will correspond to this. The relationship between language, thought, and culture is still being debated and studied. There's no definite answer. The main idea is that there is an influence of linguistic categories on thought in certain areas of domains of concepts. But the theory of linguistic determinism itself is now generally rejected because it's too radical, really. There's a lot more nuances into what can happen. I have a lot more slides to show you, which I will show you next time. And there are references of things you can read to go further into this question. And since we're going to be on holiday, you can go and borrow a book from the library to look at this. This one is in French. It's easily accessible. It's been fun to read if you have time. Have a nice afternoon and a nice break. And we'll be back here on Tuesday the 2nd of November.
Goodbye, mon enfant.